So thanks everybody. So this is a paper where I'm going to be talking about retirement preparedness among student loan borrowers. So this is joint with Serena Goodman and Sarah Reber. We're all at the board, so the disclaimer applies. These are my views and not the views of the board. Okay, so the motivation for this paper is pretty simple. We know that student loan debt has been increasing rapidly in recent decades. It's now the largest component of non-housing debt. And so the question we're going to ask is sort of what implications does this have for recent cohorts, savings, wealth accumulation, and ultimately what that might mean for retirement preparation. And so when we think about how student loan borrowing might affect wealth or retirement, there's kind of two possible directions it might go. So there's the possibility that student borrowing might increase wealth or retirement. And so we know student loans allow potential students to make high return educational investments that they might not have otherwise been able to make if they didn't have access to this liquidity from the student loan program. And we know that on average college grads enter retirement with more wealth. And there's some empirical evidence that access to student loans does seem to increase attainment and then later earnings and improves repayment. And so there's some reason to think that student loans do indeed sort of generate a return that's greater than their cost. But the flip side is that you might think that student loans might decrease wealth or retirement. So if the returns to the education that a student makes are less than the cost of debt service, they might be worse off. And you might also think that having debt sort of on your balance sheet could constrain your ability to make other investments. So maybe having a student loan, keeps you from buying a house or starting a business, or sort of there's a trade-off between direct trade-off between contributing to retirement accounts. And there's a couple of papers that suggest, these mechanisms might be in play. So what are we going to do here? We're just going to start by looking at the Survey of Consumer Finances. We're going to look at just the last two waves where we have pretty detailed information on student loans, including whose education the loan was used for. And then we're going to estimate what we call life cycle patterns. And what we mean here is that we're going to look at mean student debt holding and saving and wealth accumulation by age. And we're going to, so to be clear, this is going to be a cross section, but we're going to kind of interpret the age profile as a life cycle profile. And we're going to focus on three groups. So college educated families who have student loans on their balance sheet, college educated families who don't have student loans on their balance sheet, and then families without a college education. And when I'm going to call this part one because it's going to be kind of our first pass, which is we're going to call someone who, a student loan borrower, someone who currently has a student loan on their balance sheet. So a student loan that hasn't been paid off. Okay, so what does student debt look like over the life cycle? So the graph here shows you the percent of families at each age who have a student loan on their balance sheet. And the dashed line includes loans for both one's own education and other folks' education, so children or grandchildren. And so what do we see here? So first you can see that there's this sort of plateau on the left side of the screen, and that's kind of the area where most student loans are in sort of a standard repayment term, which is usually about 10 years. And so under age 40, you can see student loan debt ownership is pretty high, and then it kind of just falls off pretty linearly. And then just with respect to retirement, I'll just note that if you look at the sort of past age 65, almost no one is still holding student loans. I mean, it hovers very close to zero. And so sort of the idea that people, very few people essentially enter retirement still holding student loans. Okay, so now we can switch gears and think about wealth by current student debt holding across the different groups. And so when you look at this chart, what you can see is we're plotting median wealth by age, and the groups that we're going to look at is the gray line shows you college educated families without student loans, black line shows you college educated families with student loans, and then the blue is non-college educated families. And so if you look kind of at the younger ages, not surprisingly, wealth is pretty low and the groups look pretty similar. But over time, we can see that the college educated, no student loan group really starts to accumulate a lot more wealth than the other groups. And when we look out towards nearing retirement ages, you can see that the college educated group that has student loans really doesn't look any better off than the groups that didn't go to college at all. And so then the question that immediately comes to mind is like, should we infer from this that student borrowers are sort of no better off than if they hadn't gone to college at all? And so this is something that we're going to argue, we really can't infer that from this graph. And so although this sort of naive comparison suggests, yeah, it looks like, the student borrowers are no better off than if they hadn't gone to college. The fact of the matter is that if we look back to sort of 2 slides ago when I showed you student debt holding, over time, the percentage of families that are still holding student loans is just dropping really dramatically. And so by not accounting for the sort of large majority of families who are paying off their loans, we're sort of not really getting the full picture of the student loan program. And so in particular, it seems pretty likely that people who have trouble paying off their student loan are also probably, have some other factor that's probably holding back their savings patterns too. And so what we really want to do, if we want to think about in sort of like a holistic way whether student loans sort of pose a threat to the retirement system, I think we really need to look at families who we think ever borrow to finance their education. And so we're going to try to make some progress there. So what are we going to do? We have kind of 2 strategies to do this. So the first is we're going to continue using the Survey of Consumer Finances, but we're going to develop an imputation of borrowing histories. And what we mean here is we're going to use a bunch of characteristics of the individuals and try to predict whether they were someone who would have borrowed in the sort of peak borrowing years when debt would still be in standard repayment. And we're going to use a lot of things related to sort of that we think we know are salient for whether or not people borrow. So, of course, their own education, their parents' background, whether they were a veteran, things like that. And then what we're going to do is calibrate this to cohort level student loan borrowing rates from older SCFs so that we match the percent of families that were using the student loan program over time in each cohort. The second thing we're going to do is use panel data that's derived from credit reports. This is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York Consumer Credit Panel Equifax data. What we're going to do here is we're going to compare individuals who opened a credit record, so someone who's had a credit record open for them because they started borrowing in some way at the same time, and then we're going to compare those individuals by whether or not they have student loans on their record and sort of the amount of student borrowing. We're going to focus just on that for sort of initial loan, so that we're kind of trying to do as apples to apples as we can. This is going to be similar in methodology to a paper with Serena and myself wrote with a couple of other co-authors. And then when we think about wealth, the main thing we'll think about here is we're going to use if someone has a mortgage on their credit report, because we think that's a pretty good proxy for home ownership, particularly at sort of the younger ages. So what do we find? So this graph here shows you our results from the SCF, and where we've imputed whether someone was a student borrower at younger ages. And so the green shows you people who have a college education but did not borrow according to our imputation. And the blue shows you people with a college education who did borrow. And then the yellow shows you people who didn't do not have a college education. And what really jumps out here is that's quite different from sort of what I showed you earlier, is that the borrowers and non-borrowers look quite similar, and by sort of nearing retirement age have a lot more wealth than the groups that didn't go to college. Okay. We can also look sort of specifically at retirement preparation. So on the left, I'm comparing non-student borrowers and student borrowers, whether or not they participate in either a DB or DC plan at work. And then on the right, I have plotted median quasi-liquid retirement assets, so assets in IRAs, 401ks, things like that. And you can see, again, we see this really similar profile for the folks that we identify as borrowers and non-borrowers. Okay, and now I'm going to switch gears to the credit report data. So this shows whether someone has a mortgage on their credit report. Here we've divided groups. So the blue is folks who don't have student borrowing. And then the green and red just have above or below median borrowing. And so what we can see here is that sort of initially from starting someone's credit, from the initial sort of start of the credit report, you can see that the folks who don't have any student borrowing do seem to be a bit more likely to be homeowners. But once we reach the sort of later ages, it's clear that the student borrowers the folks with student borrowing on their outpace the non-student borrowers. And so by sort of 15 years from entering the credit report data, which is going to be about mid-30s, you can see that the folks with the highest amount of student borrowing are actually the most likely to be homeowners. Okay, so I will quick wrap up here. So what do we find? First, we find that just very few families continue to still hold student loans as they near retirement age. You know, that said, the sort of limited number of families who are holding student loans well into older ages, they do not look any better off than those who didn't attend college at all. And so there is possibly some scope for a very targeted policy intervention to these folks who you know, seem to be sort of struggling with their loan repayment and saving. But the sort of big takeaway that we had from our analysis is that naive comparisons between families who are holding and not holding student loans into later ages is pretty misleading, because it's clear that there's sort of probably some other factor holding back both saving and student loan repayment. When we focus instead on sort of the typical student borrower, so someone who borrowed sort of early in their life cycle to attend college, we find that those people accumulate very similar levels of wealth and seem similarly prepared for retirement as their peers who attended college and didn't borrow. And they seem to be much better off than their peers who did not attend college at all. And so this seems to suggest that student loans do sort of allow students to make valuable investments that have a return on the labor market. And just, you know, the overall takeaway, you know, from our analysis is that, you know, it doesn't look to us like the sort of expansion in student lending in recent decades is poised to have sort of major implications for the retirement landscape.